if they're going to.
How are you? Good to see you. Ooh, it's cold up here.
Remember you said it's always cold out on the stage.
I should have put on my sleeveless sweater.
Was that way this morning or not?
Oh, yeah, we had a good discussion. Very good. Could have gone on for hours.
Yes, he's on entourage too.
That's right.
Well, good afternoon, and welcome to the Wilson Center, the living memorial to the 28th President of the United States. My name is Robert Daly. I'm the director of the Kissinger Institute on China and the United States here at the Wilson Center. Very good to see so many old friends today, and I'd like a special welcome to Ambassador Sasser. We're very glad you could join us this afternoon. And happy Constitution Day. Today is the first Constitution Day ever in the People's Republic of China. This is something new. It will be interesting to see how that develops. Here in Washington, this is our second annual program, Year in Review of U.S.-China Relations, and it is titled The Year of the Horse, Viruses, Tigers, Flies, Ravenous Carp, and Vanishing Pangolins, primarily because we need a title that will bring people in when there are a lot of programs at a lot of different think tanks, and I assume that, like me, you're tired of titles that involve eagles and dragons and pandas, so we're trying to broaden the menagerie, and there are other reasons as well that we'll get to in a minute. We are going to look back at 2014 in bilateral relations, a year, I think, for most of its course of growing tensions, despite a mutual pledge in the previous year at Sunnyland to develop a new model of relations. It was, among many other things, the first year in which both a majority of Americans and a majority of Chinese, through the Pew polls, expressed a negative view of the other country. Public perceptions play a role in bilateral relations. But it's also a year in which perhaps, at least the tone, possibly some directions in the relationship have changed just in the past month or so, and I'm sure we'll be touching on that today. U.S.-China issues, it's become really sort of a cliche to talk about the great consequence and high seriousness of the relationship, the most important bilateral relationship. Even noting that this is a cliche has become cliche. And today in our discussion, I'd like to take not by no means a flippant, but a somewhat lighter or more casual tone toward these serious issues. Sun Yun and I were in my office talking about this event about 2 weeks ago, and we were reflecting on the fact that we are very, very lucky to have our jobs. Because while these issues are serious, they are also of great and inherent fascination, and it's really a privilege to be able to come and work on them every day. There's a joy to the job and a joy to sinology. I was thinking about that as well and looking back on the past year, because the Belgian sinologist Simon Leys passed away during the past year, and he was somebody who was a very important teacher via his books. I never met him, to me, and somebody who reveled in almost every aspect of traditional sinology. And so I just wanted to note his passing. He, among other things, translated the Analects of Confucius, a very fine volume which I encourage you to read. We have invited three experts to talk with us today to give us their thoughts on the year just past. Ambassador Stapleton Roy, founding director of the Kissinger Institute and now a distinguished scholar here at the Wilson Center. Sun Yun, a fellow at the Stimson Center, who has been here on the stage with us before, and also Mr. Wang Guan, senior U.S. correspondent for China Central Television. This is your first time here at the Wilson Center, so a special welcome to you. I have asked the speakers today to look back not only at particular events in the past year, but also to think a little bit about trends, to discuss major dynamics in the relationship and ways that they may be shifting. Are assumptions shifting in Beijing or Washington? Are we using the right lenses or analytic frameworks to regard each other in the relationship? And in particular, I'm going to ask you to comment on what blind spots or prejudices may be hampering analyses both here and in China. In taking on something like the year in relations, another question that there's no avoiding is, what do we mean? What is comprised when we speak of U.S.-China relations? Most of the time, at least in Washington, we are speaking of government to government. relations, political relations, security issues, and trade. But of course, there's a great deal more to our relationship than that. We're all, I think, aware of the scale of people-to-people relations, university, institutional, artistic, state, local, and municipal government interactions, schools, churches, scientific interactions. And these things, too, are part of the relationship. But we usually don't consider them in policy discussions, I think for several good reasons. One is that all of this activity is so broad, it's hard to limit the discussion usefully and to give it a clear focus in discussions of policy issues. These matters of people-to-people relations, culture, education are not quantifiable. But also, political scientists and IR theorists have no models that help us capture or describe the relationship in the totality, and that is maybe a failure of their disciplines. It is also, and those of you who are frequent guests here have heard me struggle with this aloud before, as important as we know the people-to-people relationships are, it's very difficult to identify how they have short-term specific effects on geostrategic and economic concerns. There's no translation mechanism yet between the people-to-people cultural issues and the geopolitical issues. Nevertheless, I continue to be struck that the ways that Chinese and Americans encounter each other all the time, personally, culturally, materially, these things that we can't quantify and don't discuss in think tanks can be determinative over time. And I was in Alibaba's headquarters in Hangzhou in March and was reminded of this. I met with their strategic group, and major Chinese industries are increasingly presented in the United States as very self-assertive, as bellicose sometimes, as arrogant. That was not what I found in Alibaba at all. Marvelous, thoughtful people who said, well, we've made a lot of mistakes. We really didn't see smartphones coming as a platform. Tencent took us by surprise. We're not sure how we're going to handle that. Here are the models and the values we see going forward, but we could be wrong. Genuinely humble, thoughtful folks who were talking primarily under the direction of their leader about enabling people. Alibaba exists to enable, and we were having this discussion in Chinese, so I said, well, wait, stop right there, because how do you say that in Chinese? This is an American verb, and they said, 我们也不知道, enable 就 enable 吧. We have no word for this in Chinese, so we have to speak of enabling. It was an interesting instance of cultural exchange because they had studied American vocabulary and American approaches, and now this very powerful Chinese company is making that one of its key missions. We also see in companies like Alibaba, they are increasingly using these platforms to provide public goods. They are taking deposits. The World Bank and the IMF are working with Alibaba to see if they can bring microlending and other platforms into Africa. And Alibaba, even within Hangzhou, has an international staff. There are many young Americans working there who could just as readily be working at Google. And you come away from a place like Alibaba feeling that Washington sometimes is a little bit too myopic, looking at these security dilemmas in the Western Pacific, which are very important, while places like Alibaba and companies in the United States are simply doing what they do with technologies and changing the world despite our focuses. So back to the title briefly, and then we'll turn it over to our three presenters. You all know about the tigers and flies and viruses in the title, but there are other animal stories that are less well known in U.S.-China relations. And when I first started studying Chinese, I focused on animal names at FSI because it's a great way to build vocabulary. And there's also a lot of great creativity in the Chinese language in this regard. For example, a lemur. Does anyone know how to say lemur in Chinese? It's a fox monkey, a huho. What a perfect name for a lemur. An owl is a mao tou ying, a cat-headed eagle. My favorite is the Chinese word for a sloth, which is a shulan, the laziness of the trees. So I found that this was a great way to learn vocabulary fast, and this is the way that I taught my kids Chinese early on. So I've always had an animal thing. So animal stories, just briefly, that I think say something that we miss about our relationship. Many of you know about the emerald ash borer, a pest that we introduced accidentally from China, which is consuming about 30 million American trees per year. They're eating our baseball bats all over Michigan and even here in Maryland. This is one of the ways that we get involved with each other through globalization. It's one of the downsides. But the tail end of the emerald ash borer story may well be that the secret to combating the the pest is to introduce and to graft Chinese ash borer-resistant ash trees with American ash trees. This is the direction that our scientists are now taking. So we start with a downside of globalization, Chinese pests, and we find, working through our specialists together, that there may be an approach to this. We've seen this too with snakeheads in the Potomac. You probably know this well, that came in mostly out of Chinese restaurants. It's a fearsome fish that can crawl from pond to pond on its forefins, and it eats up the local fish. It was initially seen as a threat, but now it's a major sports fish in the Potomac. There are still problems with it, but we're also beginning to eat it. We have issues with the Asian carp now threatening the Great Lakes, although this was primarily, again, this was deliberately introduced by us into Arkansas ponds in the 1970s because it cleaned up some of the pests there, and it then leapt into north-flowing rivers and is threatening to destroy the fisheries of the Great Lakes. But the most promising scientific projects underway to stop them involve working with the Chinese scientists who know this fish best, who also, as in our dinner just the other night that we had with the Counselor's Office of the State Council, they also suggested that in addition to fighting the fish, we learn to eat it as they do. So these problems bring us closer together as well. These are not all negative stories. The Chinese praying mantis, which is now in our backyards, was introduced deliberately in 1895 as a form of pest control in New England. And this flows both ways. The American white moth, also called the fall webworm, which we know is an aesthetic pest. These are tent caterpillars. When they've reached China in Shandong, they're destroying forest land and farmland there, as our red-eared slider, the beloved turtle. We call it, what we call painted turtles are usually red-eared sliders. They were introduced in the pet market in China, got free into Chinese ponds and rivers, and are now destroying native species. So why am I talking about invasive animals? I'm talking about them because Xi Jinping is very fond of talking about genetics. Several major speeches about what is and isn't in the genes of the Chinese people. The desire to chengba, to become hegemons, is not in the genes of the Chinese people. It's a favorite metaphor. Through our interaction, we are already in each other's genes, and long have been. Again, it's not always negative. And this is true not just at the level of wildlife and pests, but our technologies as well. Communications platforms and technologies developed largely in the US are now being used by Chinese to threaten species all over the world. Buyers and sellers of illegal exotic animals, including the pangolin, including elephants, and this is the major form of poaching, are using platforms like Baidu to meet each other and to buy and sell. China is becoming the largest market, for example, for poached ivory. African elephants, about 300 are killed a day, and most of that ivory is on its way to China. Sea turtles and pangolins as well. This is not an accusation against China. When I read these stories about what happens to the pangolin, the sea turtle, the elephant, I'm reminded that in looking at US-China relations, and particularly in looking at American criticisms of China, we have to remember where we have been. That in the same stage of our development, we hunted and ate species to death. Our industrialists were arguably equally corrupt. Some of our cities, like Pittsburgh, were equally polluted. And this continues to this day, of course, in China, aided and abetted by new technologies and global markets. So the challenge for us, and again, I went back and I looked at a couple of different timelines of the year, trying to think about major themes for today. The challenge, I think, for all nations and for the US and China in particular, is to reach a common understanding of these issues, of the way that technologies, global markets, ancient tastes and cultures are accelerating many problems, and to ask whether we can create regulatory regimes that serve our mutual interests, even if our mutual distrust continues to deepen. To what degree do we cooperate? To what degree do we compete? And to what degree are we able to do the two things simultaneously? Is one of the largest questions that I see looking back over 2014. And with that, I will turn it over to Ambassador Roy. How are we doing with cooperation and competition?
Thank you, and good afternoon. I'm surprised in talking about invasive species that he didn't mention non-invasive species. I think it's well known that the famous Peking duck is in fact a Long Island duck. Which was brought into China when some sort of duck plague destroyed the local varieties. That's not what I've been asked to talk about. We've been asked to take a look at the state of U.S.-China relations during 2014. Now, this is not an easy task. In mid-year, some Chinese and American observers were saying that the bilateral relationship was at its lowest point in 25 years. This is an interesting assessment, bearing in mind the following considerations. At the beginning of the year, the Senate approved a new, widely respected U.S. ambassador for Beijing. In February, PLA troops for the first time participated in the U.S.-Thailand multinational Cobra Gold military exercise in Thailand. The same month, U.S. Army Chief of Staff Odierno said he was optimistic about establishing a dialogue between the militaries of China and the United States to build trust. Meanwhile, an academic journal reported that 1/3 of foreign university students in the United States come from China. Secretary of State Kerry visited China in February, and the two countries pledged further cooperation on climate change, a pledge that was carried a step further during the meeting between the two presidents in November last month. First Lady Michelle Obama, with her mother and two daughters, visited China in March. In April, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce released a report stating that China's annual foreign direct investment in the United States now exceeded annual FDI by U.S. companies into China by most measures. The same month, Secretary of Defense Hagel visited China. In May, Treasury Secretary Jack Lew visited China. The same month, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff hosted a visit by his Chinese counterpart. In June, the Chinese Navy, for the first time, participated in the Rim of the Pacific, multinational military exercise in the waters off Hawaii, the world's largest regularly scheduled exercise of this type. In July, the sixth round of the U.S.-China Strategic and Economic Dialogue held constructive talks in Beijing, with both sides looking to the upcoming presidential summit in November. And as the year drew to a close, the two presidents had a productive summit meeting in Beijing. Discussions took place in a highly positive atmosphere and produced an agreement for further cooperation on climate change, for military confidence-building measures, and for issuance of longer-term student, tourist, and business visas. Now, that's a bad year by any definition. It's not the whole story, of course, but it just happens that I was the American ambassador in Beijing 23 years ago, very near to the low point, and this type of intense engagement between our two countries would have been beyond my wildest dreams at the time. So to say this is the worst relationship we've had in 25 years, in my opinion, lacks historical perspective. And we have Ambassador Jim Sasser in the front row here, who experienced high points in the U.S.-China relationship at that time, including reciprocal summit trips by presidents, and also had his embassy attacked and the windows broken because of anger over our bombing of the Chinese embassy in Belgrade. So the relationship has changed a lot. And to think that now we're at a low point in the relationship, in my judgment, reflects the fact that, in fact, we've made remarkable development in the relationship over the last 25 years. My point is that the U.S.-China relationship is a very complex one. It's filled with positive and negative aspects. It's not untypical of relations between major countries that are partners in some areas and are rivals in other areas. This makes it easy to distort public perceptions by cherry-picking those aspects you wish to use to make your point. Let me cite an example. In January, China announced that its new State Security Commission or National Security Commission, I don't know that there's an official title for it in English, would guard against 5 unconventional threats to China's well-being: cyber threats, separatism, terrorism, ideological struggles, and cultural threats, including the spread of Western ideas. A week later, China lifted a 3-year ban on Lady Gaga and permitted the sale of her new album. Presumably, this was a non-threatening aspect of Western culture. But you might not have assumed that would flow from the earlier decision. You have to be careful, in other words, in jumping to conclusions. The reality, of course, is that the year got off to a troubled start. in terms of the U.S.-China relationship. It began under the cloud of a Chinese announcement late last year of a new air defense identification zone in the East China Sea covering islands that are under dispute with Japan. The dispute between China and Japan over these islands inevitably affected the U.S.-China relationship because we're an ally of Japan and we recognize Tokyo's administrative jurisdiction over the islands, even though we don't recognize their sovereignty over the islands. We take no position on the sovereignty question. But these island disputes in the East China Sea and the South China Sea contributed to a sharp rise in negative Chinese attitudes toward the United States over the last 4 years, more than tripled. Chinese who think the United States is an enemy country because we're backing countries that have territorial claims against what Chinese consider to be their sovereign territory. And on the U.S. side, as Robert referred to, a new Pew poll indicated that 55% of Americans have a negative view of China. Cyber spying by both sides contributed to heightened mutual suspicions. President Obama's spring trip to a number of U.S. allies and friends in East Asia, while bypassing China, was interpreted by many Chinese as evidence of the U.S. containment strategy against China. U.S. business investors in China, long strong supporters of the U.S.-China relationship, were deeply disturbed by China's use of its anti-monopoly law against U.S. businesses. And it's worth noting that the United States could not conceal its dissatisfaction when China launched a new Asian infrastructure investment bank to which Beijing contributed $40 billion in capital. The good news is that both sides at the highest level recognize that unconstrained rivalry between China and the United States is not in the interest of either country. Leaders in both countries want to strengthen areas of cooperation. Managing this constantly changing balance between rivalry and cooperation will test leaders on both sides. And we saw that test underway this year, and I'm sure that it's going to continue next year and in fact for the indefinite future. China has moved into a more activist phase in its foreign policy. In addition to the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, China has announced plans to build a Silk Road economic belt and a 21st century maritime Silk Road to improve what they call connectivity with neighboring countries. It has also proposed a new security cooperation architecture for Asia and for the Asia Pacific. The United States will need constantly to rebalance its rebalancing strategy in East Asia to deal with these challenges. This is certain to make next year just as interesting as this one has been. Thank you.
Thank you. Sun Yun.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation to be here again. I always enjoy the opportunity, and I always enjoy Ambassador Roy's talk. It's always so insightful and makes me speechless. My angle is slightly different. As someone who is originally from China, but who has the pleasure and the luxury to work here in the policy community, I try to see the American perspectives through a Chinese lens and try to understand the Chinese perspectives through the American lens. So in my talk, I'll begin with a general description of some of the main development in 2014, followed by a discussion of the development of China's foreign policy under the Xi Jinping administration, and how those trends have transpired in 2014 into key issues of contention, conflicts, as well as cooperation between U.S. and China, and some potential implications for the future. So like Ambassador pointed out, 2014 has witnessed some very interesting development in U.S.-China relations. During the first half of the year, differences or some major tensions was rather dominant in the theme of the bilateral relations, especially around the maritime disputes in the East and South China Seas. Then starting from the summer, things took an interesting turn. The contentious aspects of the bilateral relations to a certain extent subsided, and a cooperative tone began to emerge, and even some people call prevail between U.S. and China on multiple issues. As Secretary John Kerry described last month's essays, the U.S.-China relationship at this stage is built on two pillars. One is managing differences where interests of the two countries diverge, and the other one is coordinating on issues where their interests are aligned. Although these are two different courses that seem to be contradictory with each other, in reality, they run parallel with each other. It's just at different moments, one or the other appears to be the dominant theme, affecting people's general judgment of the state of the bilateral relations. On the side of the differences, it's worth pointing out that in the U.S. policy community, the perception is that China has been very much on the driver's seat for the tension. That is, that it has been China who took various initiatives, assertive initiatives, on issues such as East China Sea ADIS or the South China Sea that drove up the tension. Then when China decided to tone down the tension to either manage the damage or to amend the ties in preparation for major regional multilateral events, such as before the ASEAN Regional Forum and APEC, China was able to do so through its own tactical adjustments. Those adjustments, some of the examples include the withdrawal of the Chinese oil rig 981, before the ARF meeting in August, and China showing a lot of love through financial contributions and commitments towards its neighbors before APEC in November. So these tactical shifts certainly have affected U.S. policies and actions in the short term and for the time being, but they do not, and we don't think they cannot, we think they cannot make the differences between the two countries go away. And people expect that problems such as maritime disputes will reemerge and come back and continue to affect bilateral relations. So what we will continue to witness in the coming year is a fluctuation of the bilateral relations depending on the priorities of Beijing and Washington, as well as the resolve on both sides to pursue such priorities. The two key variables in the U.S.-China relations are, of course, the foreign policy postures and strategies of the two sides. The second term of the Obama administration has continued its commitment to the rebalancing to Asia strategy. In China, this strategy is also continued to be perceived as an American effort to contain or undermine China's rise. During the past 2 years, what has changed more is China's foreign policy course, given the strategic adjustments under the Xi Jinping administration. So China recalibrated its geographical priority of its foreign strategy to its periphery, as highlighted by the Periphery Diplomacy Working Conference in October 2013. China enhanced the efforts to pursue solidarity and cooperation with developing countries and emerging powers so as to reform the international system and global governance. It also seeks to expand its influence and improve ties with neighbors and developing world through utilizing China's vast financial capitals. And those examples, like Ambassador just mentioned, include the mega connectivity projects in Asia, Latin America, Africa, initiatives such as the Silk Road Economic Belt, the Maritime Silk Road, as well as the new financial development institutions, such as the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, the BRICS Bank, and the 40 billion Silk Road Fund to build infrastructure and enhance business cooperation. Relations with major powers are still important in China's foreign policy lexicon, as it always has been. But now the relationship with major powers is only one of the several priorities in the mapping of China's foreign strategy. And the goal, as elaborated in the Foreign Affairs Working Conference last week, has been relatively modest. The goal on the relationship with major powers is defined as to manage well relations with major powers and to construct a healthy and stable framework of major power relations. Compared with the overarching focus on relations with the U.S. under the previous Hu Jintao administration, the moderate and realistic expectation under Xi indeed suggests changing characteristics and diversified priorities of China's foreign policy. What does this mean for U.S.-China relations? First of all, it suggests that overall China is more confident and is more adept in utilizing all resources available to rally support for its own agenda. Since China is keen on defining the goals and the policy courses on its own, and is also keen on constructing what they call a great power diplomacy, it has made it more difficult for external actors to shape China's agendas or influence China's behaviors. On its relationship with the U.S., of course, China made a proposal to construct a new model of major power relations with the U.S. last year. And this has been perceived in China to be the key product of the Sunnyland Summit in June 2013, as well as Xi Jinping's main strategic thinking on U.S.-China relations. However, many in the U.S. have interpreted the proposal as for U.S. and China to divide a sphere of influence and respect each other's sphere of influence, or a proposal to formulate a transactional relationship between the two so that they can trade favors. Therefore, while China has been more enthusiastic about the operationalization of the new model of major power relations and attributing almost all positive developments in the bilateral relations to the creation of the framework, U.S. has been more interested in seeking and materializing practical cooperation and is less concerned about glorifying the term proposed by Beijing. If we see the U.S.-China relations as a coin, then I would argue that differences and cooperation are the two sides of the same coin. Neither the positive government rhetoric nor the sensational media stories about the upcoming conflict between U.S. and China quite reflect the true complex nature of the relationship. So indeed, in 2014, there have been several areas of direct tensions or indirect clashes between Beijing and Washington, and it's very easy for them to overshadow the general perception of the bilateral relations. We can talk about some examples, such as China pushing the envelope in the East and South China Seas. For U.S., China's assertive actions raise a concern about regional peace and stability to begin with. It also jeopardizes potential conflicts between U.S. and China, given U.S. alliance commitment to its allies, including Japan and the Philippines. China's action in U.S. perspective also challenged the regional order, challenged the international law, and challenged the rule of law. So on the other hand, from the Chinese perspective, China also interprets a lot of great deal of hostility coming from United States through various cases of U.S. emboldening its allies in the maritime disputes, its unfair and unjust criticism of China on the issue of East and South China Seas, as well as examples such as the DOJ indictment of the 5 PLA officers. So the clash of ideas and positions is expected to continue in 2015. However, on the bright side, there have also been encouraging signs of cooperation in several areas, in multiple areas, that would give us, the policy wonks, a little bit more confidence about the future of U.S.-China relations. U.S. has been particularly appreciative of China's cooperation on nuclear non-proliferation issues, including both North Korea and Iran. Although China also has had its own strategic calculations on these two issues for the cooperation, its actions nevertheless contribute to Washington's policy agenda. U.S. and China announced ambitious but promising agreements on climate change last month in Beijing, and it will foreseeably boost the climate change and clean energy cooperation between the two sides. Furthermore, common interest on fighting terrorism and terrorist organizations, such as the Islamic State, have accelerated and expanded the desire and dedication on both sides to engage in counterterrorism dialogue for potential cooperation. On other global and regional challenges, such as the Ebola crisis and the reconstruction of Afghanistan, U.S. and China both have demonstrated the interest and tendency to pursue cooperation to advance global public good. So what does this all mean? It means that in the foreseeable future, U.S. and China will continue this love-hate relationship. The fact is that despite their diverging goals, interests, and despite their distrust, the two countries have to find constructive ways to coexist. U.S. would very much like to develop an effective counter-strategy to deal with China's assertively pushing the envelope. However, with China's rising national power, increasingly sophisticated foreign strategies, and the complex intertwined interests between the two sides, such a clear-cut solution is simply not available in the near future. From the Chinese perspective, China still perceives the U.S.-led alliance system in Asia as a threat to its national security, and Beijing would very much like to replace it with an Asian security architecture led by Asia, but supposedly defined and centered on Beijing. However, at this point, China also understands very well that it is merely a fact that China is not yet able to directly challenge the U.S. supremacy or replace it in the near future either. Furthermore, China also cannot remove the fear from of many regional countries about China's true intentions and China's coercive policy to get what China wants. Therefore, China cannot really stop regional countries from seeking the support and even the protection by the United States. So the current state of the bilateral relations may not be what either side finds most comfortable, but it's what they will both have to live with. Therefore, managing differences while seeking cooperation is perhaps indeed the most sensible strategy for both sides to pursue. Thank you.
Thank you. Wang Guan, I gave you particular welcome and then handed you the toughest assignment, going after two other speakers who are looking back at the same material.
Sure. Thank you, Robert. And I'd like you to know that what a pleasure it is, Ambassador Cesar and Ambassador Roy, to share this occasion with you. I remember very well that when Ambassador Cesar, those days when your embassy was attacked, I was second year in my junior high school. I was helping write those anti-American posters because I was one of the angry youth myself back then. That was 1997. And, it was very cohesive moment back in the class. And Ambassador Roy, when you engaged in those behind-the-room maneuvers with Deng Xiaoping to establish this very relationship, I wasn't even born. So what an honor it is to be here.
This was in anticipation of your birth.
I'd like to share my thoughts on this relationship from the perspective of a journalist. I covered this relationship for the past 8 years, and based on my interactions with American senior officials in the past year, and also back in my China days, which was 4 years ago, back in my China days, how I interacted with the Chinese military and political officials, I'd like to offer some of my observations of what this relationship, where this relationship was in the past year and where it is going. I think there are many levels to this relationship, a conceptual level, there are practical level, and also there's an issue of perception, which CCTV media, media organizations like CCTV helped contribute. Media help contribute perception as well as a misperception. So I'd like to talk about what CCTV is doing here in America in the later part of my discussion. I think on the conceptual level, it's not hard to notice that I think American officials are backing off from this concept of a new type of major power relationship. You didn't hear Ambassador Rice talk about it when she visited China 2-3 months ago when she laid the groundwork for the presidential meetings. And you didn't hear Secretary Kerry talk about it when he received State Councilor Yang Jiechi in his Boston home. And when President Obama was in Beijing meeting with President Xi in the joint press conference, he didn't mention that concept either. Instead, President Obama said we should seek truth from facts. And in my interview with Ambassador Susan Rice a month ago, when I asked her this question, she didn't answer. He didn't use the very phrase either. So my sense is that, correct me if I'm wrong, Ambassador Roy, that there has been a second thought from this current administration on what this concept should be about. The American side want no concessions, especially when the Chinese side keep emphasizing that this new type of major power relationship is more about the core interests of China when it comes to East China Sea, South China Sea, and also this concept from the Chinese side shows China's growing aspirations in Asia-Pacific region. But I think there's also a cultural difference here. In America, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think people like to build experiences first. They like to do stuff, have practical cooperation, and then define it. But in China, my sense is growing up there and born and raised there, my sense is that we like to define a concept first, to conceptualize it, because that gives positive with a positive mental attitude that attracts positive changes, and with a positive definition, and then you can do stuff, right? You're my friend, so as a friend, we can build, we can do stuff together. I think it's just like the dating culture here in China and America. In America, correct me if I'm wrong, David, because I think by your standard, probably haven't graduated here.
That's
but,
his TV name.
Right. I think in America, you see someone, right? And then you build experiences. You go to a movie, you have grab drinks, and then you date someone, which may or may not be an open relationship. And then you have a committed relationship. And then you can say, this is my boyfriend or girlfriend. But in China, the world is getting more alike. But back in 30 years ago or 20 years ago in China, I think, especially my parents' generation, you have to define this relationship first. Okay, he's a boyfriend material or she is a wife material, so that we can do stuff. Only by giving the concept first can we do certain things and build on this concept. So I think this major power relationship is also about the cultural difference, where we think that with a good concept, of course, some may say, oh, you guys like slogans. Of course, there's a slogan culture back in China. But I think it's also true that we think it's important to have a positive mental attitude with this concept. In the past year, I think the underlying driver of this relationship is the increasingly intertwined economic and investment relationship. And in terms of security and military relationship, the two sides just don't trust each other. You know, when I was in China covering a couple of military joint drills, and when I was embedding the Chinese military, PLA Navy, when I talked to those major generals and lieutenants and rear admirals, they just don't trust Americans. And during my past 4 years here, I feel this mutual animosity. And for example, on the cybersecurity issue, I want to talk about a very specific issue because I think this issue is very important. When Sun Yun just mentioned that when 5 PLA soldiers were indicted and their faces were put on a poster, wanted by FBI, personally I think that's not very constructive, because I know there's a distinction between economic espionage and traditional intelligence gathering. But I think that I don't think that Americans don't do economic espionage on the Chinese. I raised this question with Secretary John Kerry this July in this interview with him, and I cited Edward Snowden's allegations where NSA allegedly spied on the EU enterprises, including the EU Trade Commissioner Joaquin Almunia, because this very commissioner fined Microsoft and Google and threatened to fine Intel. And also, allegedly, NSA spied on Petrobras, China Mobile. And I asked Secretary Kerry, how are these activities different from what the U.S. accused China of doing? I mean, is there an American double standard here? And he said none whatsoever. And there's no ordered, instructed efforts by the administration to spy on Chinese or worldwide businesses. But then I provided a congressional report back in 1996. This report is called Aspin-Brown Report. And in it, it says, the U.S. government spies on foreign firms to identify situations abroad where the U.S. companies might be placed at a competitive disadvantage. And thanks to such efforts, the U.S. has obtained billions in foreign contracts it would otherwise have lost. And then Secretary Kerry said he doesn't know about this specific report, but he said, I quote, I don't know if somebody gathered something or did it on their own. I can't tell you that, but it's not a government policy. I think this is, I interpret this to mean an acknowledgement that economic espionage might be happening the other way around, from the U.S. side on the Chinese side. So I just want to get this straight, because when we watch American television and read newspapers here, it seems that we're the ones doing the stealing in terms of economic data. Of course, there's a creativity issue. Having been through China's educational system, I have to confess that there's a creativity issue, critical thinking issue that has to be better fostered, and better awareness to protect intellectual property back in China. And another example that I would like to highlight is the growing mistrust between the two militaries, the near collision incident in South China Sea in Hainan. I think, again, if you read reports here, for example, the New York Times said the Pentagon accused Chinese fighter jet confronting American Navy plane, and Yahoo said China warplane in dangerous intercept with the U.S. jet. And Wall Street Journal and CNN had similar headlines. Reading this, that gives people the impression that the Chinese are indeed very aggressive and bellicose, and was the troublemaker. But I think that on the micro level, it is true that the Chinese warplane might be just 9 meters from a U.S. Fighter jet, but on the macro level, it is the U.S. warplane doing reconnaissance missions some 130 miles off the coast of Hainan. And according to UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, a foreign country has a right to conduct such activities, to send overflight in one's exclusive economic zone where the U.S. plane was, but that is subject to the regulations of the coastal state. So I think at least there's a 50-50 chance, there's a 50-50 legitimacy in their competing claims in this issue. But reading reports here, that gives the whole world the perception that the Chinese were very aggressive, and it's plane almost interjected the American plane. You can also spin the story the other way. Well, the U.S. media portrayed it as a Chinese plane intercepting the American plane issue. But on the other side, you can say this is the U.S. reconnaissance and Chinese counter reconnaissance issue. That's why I think that it's in the next year, it can be very challenging for the two sides, the two militaries, the national security team on each other to truly trust each other. Why? Because if you read the two foreign policy speeches given by President Xi and President Obama in just last month, you can get some hints. In President Xi's 外事工作会议, the China's national security meeting just a few weeks ago, he used many words that I think is very new. He said we should 主动谋划,努力进取. We should proactively plan and strategize our foreign policy in striving for achievements. And also he said it's an irreversible trend that the world is becoming multipolar. I think that means no country can claim to be the sole superpower any longer. And also I think that is a modification, if not a departure, from Deng Xiaoping's 韬光养晦 policy, laying low policy, foreign policy. And also, prior to that, President Obama gave a speech in the University of Queensland in Australia, where he said he will revive mutual defense guidelines with Japan. The two countries are seeking more expensive U.S.-Japan defense alliance, allowing reinterpretation of the wartime constitution involving Article 9, allowing the Japanese Army and Navy to play a bigger role. I think that is a hypersensitive issue in China. So if the mutual defense treaty is upgraded between U.S. and Japan, I think that will spell more trouble potentially for U.S.-China relationship. And also, President Obama said he's willing to arm the Vietnamese Navy's capabilities, also help train more Philippine soldiers. And also, I think these countries that have competing sovereignty claims with China are helped by the U.S., or so it was perceived, will complicate the security relationship between China and the U.S. So, yeah, this is...
Thank you. You're analogizing between the major the new model of major power relations and dating behaviors. That sounds a lot like
an analogy. I mean,
it sounds like a description of what Xi Jinping is calling 正能量, right? This positive energy that he wants to inject into culture. And he recently called for this in his meeting with artists and entertainers, praising Zhou Xiaoping and other bloggers. You mentioned Xi Jinping at length. I wanted to actually ask each of you, there seems both on the Chinese side and on the American side, in looking at the relationship, a much stronger emphasis on Xi Jinping, what he says, what he does, than there was on either of his two predecessors. In thinking about the relationship, how important a focus is that? Should we continue to look at China at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, at the various power centers in the way we've traditionally regarded it, or should we be looking as closely as we seem to be at Xi Jinping, his proclivities, his speeches? How important a role does he play? Throw that for anybody.
I'll gladly answer that. And instead of letting my Chinese colleague answer it more authoritatively, I think that we have to pay very close attention to statements by Xi Jinping. I think it's partly a reflection of the fact that he has become the principal spokesperson in the Chinese government for these new ideas that are flowing out in a wide range of different areas, whether it's the economic reform program at the party's third plenum, whether it's the legal reforms that they discussed at the fourth plenum, or whether it involves these new initiatives in foreign affairs. On the other hand, I think it is very important, and those of us practitioners, such as Ambassador Sasser and myself, we always pay very close attention to what President Jiang Zemin said and what President Hu Jintao said. They did have some initiatives that needed to be paid attention to, but on the other hand, they didn't come up with the same flow of new ideas that are emerging from President Xi. I think the problem for outside observers is that we know that what President Xi says is important, but we cannot find people on the Chinese side who can explain what the content of the ideas is. This applies, for example, to these proposals for a new type of security cooperation architecture. Only Xi Jinping has referred to that. Generally, the foreign ministry has not picked up that concept. They've picked up the concept of the adjectives that he used in describing the concept behind the new architecture, where he's talked about it should be common, comprehensive, cooperative, and sustainable are the terms he used. But he didn't use architecture with respect to those adjectives. So that in his foreign policy speech that you referred to, for example, he doesn't refer to the architecture himself, but he refers, using those four adjectives, to the security concept that he's promoting. Well, you know, those of us who are concerned about security architectures need to know what is the idea he has for translating these security concepts into architecture. Because in his earlier speeches, he used very specific language in Chinese, 架构, which has a concrete sense of an organizational structure of some sort. And yet we don't know what he has in mind. We don't know whether it replaces existing security architectures or whether it's a supplement to existing architectures. So I think President Xi's statements are getting the attention they deserve, but our problem at the moment is we're getting more ideas than we're getting explanations. And so therefore there's a problem in assessing the full implication of the ideas that are emerging.
Why don't we open it up then to the audience, and I'd also like to invite our three panelists, if you have questions for each other, either based on the presentations or anything else that might occur to you, I'd welcome a discussion. Why don't we get a mic to the back, and in the meantime, Wang Guan, you have a question?
Ask a question to Ambassador Roy. I'm more comfortable asking questions. So Ambassador Roy, we know that when you try to establish this relationship with Deng Xiaoping back in the 77 and 78, a key issue where the discussions were stuck at one point was U.S. arms sales to Taiwan, right?
Right.
Deng Xiaoping didn't like the idea. And when you informed him one day and obviously angered him, how did you make him change his mind? Because this looks like an issue of core interest from the Chinese? How did you make him change his mind to accept this idea so that you can establish this relationship?
We didn't make him change his mind. He remained unalterably opposed to U.S. arms sales to Taiwan. But on the U.S. side, we had recognized that to get diplomatic relations with China, we had to break our diplomatic relationship with the Republic of China. We had to end our security treaty, and we had to end our military presence on Taiwan. To have ended arms sales would have destroyed the political base in the United States for normalizing relations with the People's Republic of China. So it was never on the table as a negotiable issue on the U.S. side. But we had to make clear to Deng Xiaoping that we intended to continue arms sales. And our instructions included language that was intended to make it clear. But at the same time, the concern on our side was if we presented it in the wrong way, it might prevent establishing diplomatic relations. So when we were just about to make the announcement on establishing diplomatic relations, President Carter, correctly in my judgment, asked us in Beijing, does Deng Xiaoping understand that we will be continuing arms sales? And so we had to go back in and see Deng Xiaoping after we'd already reached agreement on the joint communique we would be issuing and clarify for him, using blunter language than we had used before, that we had to continue arms sales. And he said that was absolutely unacceptable. So we had, shall we say, some discussion. And in the final analysis, and he asked Ambassador Woodcock, he said, what should we do? And Ambassador Woodcock said, we can't resolve this issue, but he thinks we can deal with it more effectively within a diplomatic relations than without a diplomatic relationship. And Deng Xiaoping said, okay. So he didn't change his view. He was opposed, but he decided not to let it block establishing diplomatic relations. That's the background of the issue.
Thank you. Sun Yun, and there's a question at the back.
I have a very short question for Mr. Wang. I really like your analogy between the conceptual differences, dating behaviors of China and dating behaviors of the United States. Then coming back to the issue of to where the analogy originated, to the new model of major power relations. So what you described seems to be because of the conceptual differences between U.S. and China, the approach that China adopted to propose that relationship was problematic, and it was not the American practice to define a relationship from the very beginning. But then you also mentioned that U.S. is having the second thought about the relationship. So my question is, do you think that the problem is with China's approach to the relationship or the proposal of the relationship itself? That if China adopted a different approach, say China did not define the relationship from the very beginning, instead try to pursue all these different initiatives, would things have worked out?
I think my sense is that senior U.S. officials have not totally backed off from this idea, this concept. They don't want, for example, when Evan Medeiros, I would say the mastermind in the White House National Security Team, aide to Susan Rice and President Obama on China affairs, during an interview with a Japanese newspaper, he said, and in my opinion, he probably make up all the drafts, all the speeches for Obama's China matters. And he said, the administration is very clear about what this new type of major power relationship is and is not about. So there are some overlapping interests, in my opinion, that they don't want the rising power and the established power to collide with each other, but also they don't want to give too much concessions to China's so-called core interests. As your question, I think this is a cultural thing. You know, we like to have a concept first, a scientific outlook on development. You know, the three represents coined by the previous presidents of China. I think this is a cultural thing, but in reality, the two countries are doing pretty much of the same things. They established, they used to have a cyber working group, and now they have a climate change working group. And then they have many mid to lower level working groups that deals with security issues, such as a military hotline to inform each other about potential maritime conflicts. I think they're pretty much doing what this new power relationship entails. It's just that we're more keen on coining a word and spreading it out and attracting attention, whereas for the American side, it seems that they're backing off from saying it, but they're doing pretty much what this notion is about. It will be interesting to see what next year will be like.
Do you?
I want to comment on this subject because I think it's very important to understand. There's no backing away on the U.S. side, and I think you accurately put your finger on it. The concept of the new type of great power relationship was to bring our strategic rivalry under control and not let it dominate the relationship, but to keep the balance between rivalry and cooperation. And Dai Bingguo wrote a very important article on this, which he laid that out. And Secretary Clinton, when she was the Secretary of State, used similar language in describing the concept. Xi Jinping himself has described the concept using different words. He said it involves no conflict, no confrontation, mutual respect, and without saying mutual respect for core interests. He says mutual respect and win-win cooperation. We tend to talk about it in terms of managing the balance between rivalry and cooperation. But there is the aspect of Americans are not entirely comfortable using a Chinese formulation, which makes it look as though the Americans have bought into a Chinese proposal. And in fact, this is a reciprocal proposal. It's not a question of our agreeing to something the Chinese proposed. It's that there's been mutual agreement on the need to not let our relationship move into destructive strategic rivalry. An interesting parallel in this is, how is it that peaceful rise became peaceful development? Well, the story is very interesting. The concept of peaceful rise was originated by a close advisor to President Hu Jintao. It didn't come out of the foreign ministry or the military establishment. They didn't like the term. So Hu Jintao had endorsed it. But a 2-year campaign against the term peaceful rise took place inside China, and finally they decided keep the same substance, no change whatsoever, but it all of a sudden became peaceful development. Everybody was happy, except the advisor who had lost that particular term, but the concept remained. So it seems to me the question of whether we talk about a new type of great power relationship or use some other terminology isn't the essence. The essence is, do our top leaders want to not let our relationship become dominated by destructive, Cold War-style strategic rivalry? The answer is there's total agreement on that. It was reaffirmed in the Beijing talks last month. It was reaffirmed in their meeting in The Hague when they met, and it was, of course, discussed at the Sunnyland Summit a year and a half ago. So I just want to make that clear in terms of how I understand my own government views the issue.
Thank you. First question way at the back, and then come down.
Stanley Cobra, this follows on very well. In late September, China Daily published an article that said, I'll just read 2 sentences, the policy of non-alignment should be updated. History shows that allies are necessary for any rising power in order to ease the security pressure from the alliances of the existing powers. This is the first time I've seen anything from China that said a formal policy of non-alignment should be dropped. Even the SCO, they said it's not an alliance. Now an article appears that says we need alliances to counter the existing alliances. And that begs the question, who would participate with China in that alliance? The obvious candidate is Russia. What would that imply, given the state of U.S.-Russian relations right now? Even Gorbachev has warned of the possibility of a new Cold War. So that is the question. How seriously do the panelists take this change of language here? This China Daily is broaching this. And would this mean a closer relationship then with Russia then having more influence on Chinese policy?
The SCO is the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, of which China and Russia are both members.
Whose language was it? Was it an editorial of the newspaper?
So this was China Daily. Was this an editorial? Like I know that some scholars like Yan Xuetong have also called for a revisiting of this.
No, the issue is under debate in China, but the China Daily was getting ahead of itself. In his authoritative speech at this National Work Conference on Foreign Affairs, Xi Jinping again said we should make friends while abiding by the principle of non-alignment and build a global network of partnership. So they're talking partnership, not alignment in the sense of a treaty relationship. That's the way I read it. I mean, you've seen the text of the speech too.
I read it too. I think Ambassador Roy, President Xi said it will build 新国际秩序,新国家关,新大国关系. 新大国关系 obviously refers to a new type of major power relationship with the U.S. But 新国际格局, or so I remember, was the original wording, is the new world order, international, the architecture that guides international relations. I think it's not hard to tell when he first assumed power. He first visited Russia, and then the African countries, and now that there is this westward expansion projects to link Central Asia and the Mideastern countries, and also the Maritime Silk Road. And on top of that, Moscow and Beijing decided to build a bullet train that reduces the travel time between Beijing and Moscow from 6 days to just 48 hours. I think it largely depends on the national security team and Xi himself on whether or not they want to break this tradition of non-alliance, I think, which was initially proposed by Premier Zhou Enlai. Like Ambassador Roy said, I think that architecture is still pretty much in place, but I think President Xi does want a more assertive foreign policy, more assertively build partnerships and make more friends.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
Mike Masedig, thanks for the panel. First, to make one observation, it's not only with the Chinese that do we have these cultural differences that you were describing. Frequently with the French, we are told we know something works in practice, but you have to first tell us that it works in principle. I know that for much of this year, and we've talked about it here, the various disputes over islands were raising tensions, whether you're talking about the Diaoyu or the Spratlys or whatever. But are you surprised by the fact that as of the end of this year, it's two other islands that are perhaps becoming the real bone of contention yet again between the United States and other Western countries and China? First is Hong Kong, where the president has flatly said this is an internal issue and the United States and Britain should stay out of it. And clearly Hong Kong is having a bank shot effect on Taiwan, which is very much the core interest of China with these elections. And we'll see, they were local elections, but let's see how they play out on the national level. But if this opposition party comes back into power, we're back into a new level of tension on Taiwan.
So Nguyen, would you like to take a first crack at it? Hong Kong and Taiwan.
And I'm so sorry. So the question is how those two islands are going to affect U.S.-China relations?
Yeah.
We're back into a new level of tension here.
Well, if I have to compare the tension between U.S. and China over the issue of Hong Kong and the tension between the two countries over the South China Sea and East China Sea, I would say that it's not quite comparable, because simply because the tensions that we have observed, or the policy or the reaction from China about U.S. policy on the issue of Hong Kong has not been as violent or as has not been as intense as in the issue of the maritime disputes. Then I agree with you that the situation in Taiwan is going to have a major impact over U.S.-China relationship. But the result of the election this time there will be another 2 years before the presidential election. And even DPP does win in the 2016 election, there are still a lot of factors that are uncertain in its domestic and cross-strait policies.
Ambassador Roy Wang-Guan, any thoughts on Taiwan or Hong Kong in the relationship?
I think the nature of the island disputes and the nature of the issues involving Hong Kong and Taiwan are fundamentally different. The island disputes are territorial disputes on which the United States takes no position on sovereignty. In the case of Hong Kong, the issue is how you nominate the chief executive. That's the core of the dispute issue. And that involves an interpretation of the basic law, which is a public document and anybody can read it. There's no territorial dispute involved in that issue. And ultimately, Chinese sovereignty over Hong Kong is recognized because it reverted to China in 1997. So that it's really a legal issue of interpretation. In our country, it would be ultimately resolved by a court. But that's not the setup now. It's the Standing Committee of the National People's Congress that's the ultimate arbiter of the interpretation of the basic law. So that's the problem in the Hong Kong case. In the case of Taiwan, it's largely a repetition of the situation you faced in 2000, when Chen Shui-bian had the potential of becoming the president of Taiwan. He came from the DPP that had a platform advocating independence for Taiwan. He was president of Taiwan for 8 years and made no progress toward independence, and in fact actually expanded relations with the mainland during his period as president. So that while this is obviously a setback for the KMT in terms of their aspirations to move ahead in the cross-strait relationship, and it's possible you'll end up with a DPP president of Taiwan in 2016, there's no reason to assume that that's going to disrupt the cross-strait relationship. It may affect the pace with which you can take further progress in the cross-strait relationship. But the reality is that even under DPP governments, it's been in Taiwan's interest to let economic relations with the mainland expand. And on a recent trip to Taiwan, I found that most people assume, including the DPP leadership, that that would probably continue if they were to win the elections. So I think the disputes are of a different nature, but you're quite correct in saying that those are two issues that have arisen or that are factors in the U.S.-China relationship. The Taiwan issue is really, at the moment, a Taiwan issue, not a U.S.-China issue. Yeah.
Thank you, State. Yes, Hank.
Thank you. Hank Levine with the Albright-Stonebridge Group. Ambassador Roy made the statement that it would be hard to justify saying that bilateral relations are the worst they've been in the last 25 years. But taking one kind of subset, as all of you have discussed, maybe one could justify the statement that the level of mistrust on each side is the highest level we've seen in 25 years. It just seems to me that on the Beijing, on both sides, there has been this kind of souring of the relationship, of attitudes toward the relationship, even among very senior officials in both countries. On the Chinese side, this sense that the U.S. is trying to contain and weaken China, and on the U.S. side, this rising sense of the China threat. And so I guess my question is, would you agree with the characterization, any of you, all three of you? And if so, if this level of mistrust now is reaching sort of historic proportions, how worried should we be about it, and where do we think this is going, and what will the impact be over the longer run? Thank you.
This gets into the question of the new type of major country relationship. I seem to recall that it was a very short number of years ago that people were saying this was the best relationship we'd had in 30 years. And I shuddered when I heard that. Because I don't like to think in terms of you reach sort of acmes and nadirs in the relationship. It's more like a sine wave curve. You have periods of higher tension and periods of lower tension in the relationship, and that's going to continue. I do not think this is the worst relationship we've had in 25 years. In fact, as I tried in my remarks to point out, the areas of cooperation between us are quite different from 25 years ago. So in other words, the relationship has moved to a whole different quality as the decades have passed. There is no doubt that the problem of strategic rivalry between the two countries is not under control. The two governments at the highest level have reached agreement that we need to address that problem. And that's whatever language you use, whether it's balancing cooperation and rivalry or whether it's a new type of major nation relationship, it's talking about that problem. That problem is not yet solved. And in fact, strategic rivalry is continuing to increase mutual mistrust on each side. But we have some new positive elements that are entering into it. The mutual mistrust was increasing before with no contacts between our military establishments. Now our military establishments at both the highest levels and at, shall we say, operational levels are beginning to start operating between each other. That process doesn't change things overnight, but it means that each side has a better opportunity to evaluate whether the other people are really determined to be enemies of your country or not. And my guess is they'll discover that that's not the case. So in other words, I think that this is still an issue that can be managed, but so far it hasn't been brought within a stable framework for management. And that's what the two countries are struggling to find the best way to address it.
Wang Guan, do you have any thoughts on this question of mistrust in public perceptions? We've heard for years in America Chinese criticisms about what they see as biased reporting, one-sided reporting.
Right.
But then we also see, when we look at China, and it seems to me with growing frequency, government orchestrated criticism of Western culture, American culture, praise of bloggers like Zhou Xiaoping. These voices seem to be growing, and there's as Ambassador Roy mentioned, it's one of the non-traditional threats that the National Security Commission may or may not be looking at. It was one of the things that was on their list. We don't know that anything's been done, but this notion that Western culture and values, much of which means America, is perhaps an existential threat, government orchestrated rather than media. You spend a lot of time in the trenches. I'd be interested in your views.
Right. I think, 4 years ago when I first came to this country, I was asked, what exactly is CCTV intending to do here in America? How do you want to cover America? Are you going to be a group of reporters who tirelessly dig the dark corners of America and doing this anti-American propaganda and feed that to the domestic Chinese audience? I think 4 years down the road now, I can better answer this question. No. This is a multifaceted, this is a nuanced issue. Yes. I think our reporting, to some extent, reflects the China's foreign policy priorities, which is not unusual given that we're a state media. All media serve the interests of its stakeholders. But on the hard news, yes, you hear a lot of negative stuff about America because I think these days bad news make headlines, be it the government shutdown, the congressional gridlock, and the foreign policy dilemma President Obama faces. That's the things that we cover. But we also have about 4 or 5 reporters who do soft news, who do 8 to 12-minute documentaries about America, which was aired on CCTV 新闻频道, Mandarin Chinese channel, and CCTV4, and those CCTV Mandarin channels that really reach even the remote Western hinterland villagers, has a broad reach, a big viewership back in China. And those stories are really telling amazing stories about American society. I'll give you some example. Before I came here, I did talk to some of my fellow reporters. For example, my reporter Shen Chen did the story about Hurricane Sandy, the after effects. There's this so-called photo lady, a lady who wasn't exactly the most popular lady because she wasn't very popular back then. But after Hurricane Sandy, she thinks she better do something, so she started picking the photos that was carried away during the hurricane. And they picked one photo and then another, and day after day after day, he picked tens of thousands of photos and trying to return them to a grocery store in the village for people to claim it. And then it turned into a non-profit business, so people start coming into the grocery store and without meeting this lady, because this lady wanted them to have more privacy, to start collecting those photos. And this photo lady said, the photos may be very small, but it takes a big place in people's heart. And it was a 12-minute documentary aired on the second day of the Lunar New Year this year, 大年初二, at 12 p.m., prime time. I suppose hundreds of millions of Chinese viewers were probably watching that documentary. Lots of stuff like this. We highlight the technological advancement of America. We're humble storytellers because, come on, let's face it, here they have more advanced technology. We have teams covering Hollywood, how Frozen, that movie, used animation to capture the nuanced facial expressions, how to make snow more real in a movie. And our reporters went to Iowa and Illinois to show the Chinese audience how to better preserve corns. And also, in wake of China's recycled oil, 地沟油, gutter oil incident, the oil recycled from sewer drains, disgusting stuff. And then we did a story about how American restaurants use healthy cooking oil. Yes, on the hard news side, it's pretty much, we pretty much discover those controversial issues, but we also dedicate about 5-6 reporters, half of a reporting team, to cover the technologies, the human interest stories, the culture of America. That's why if you ask every Chinese citizens, they look up to America. I mean, the mutual animosity, I think, largely was about America's pivot to Asia and security and military posture. But when asked about, do they want to live in America? Yes, they do. Lots of Chinese think actually America is a panacea to all China's problems. They think China has corruption issue, air pollution, food safety issue, and they think as if by coming to America or visiting America, living in America, this is not a paradise, but this is an ideal place to live and to study.
Our moon is rounder.
Yes, please.
Can I just add one short sentence on the issue of trust? Trust is not a necessary condition for two countries to cooperate or coexist. Mutual interests are. And it's through those cooperation and coexistence that we try to foster, or the two countries are trying to foster a higher level of trust. The issue of distrust between U.S. and China may never be resolved in the end, but it does not mean that the two sides cannot cooperate or work on issues that are important to both of them.
Bob, up front, and then back to Alan, and then you will get the last question. And time is running tight, so short questions and short answers.
Thank you, reporter from the Voice of America. I have two questions concerning to the new types of major power relations. And I've been to several seminars, and on one seminar, I heard that one of the panelists mentioned that the new types of major power relation is almost dead, because when China mentioned that new types of major power relation, China actually is focused on its core interests. And he said that it's up to China to decide the core interest, and the U.S. shouldn't touch it. That's one thing. On the other seminar, one of the panelists mentioned that the U.S. shouldn't be dragged into this new type of major power relations, because when China mentioned that, it means that the U.S. and China, two of them decide the issues, the future of the world. Because that's the reason why he said we shouldn't be dragged into this concept, because it's against the U.S.'s national interest. In Asia, U.S. should pursue a kind of multipolar system. Thank you.
We've covered a lot of these questions previously. Any other thoughts on the new model or the repetition of this phrase? I think Ambassador Roy, you've offered a fairly thorough explanation already.
I don't think the idea is dead. The core interest issue, in my judgment, has been blown out of proportion. China can define its own core interests, but the demand that every other country has to respect China's core interests the way it defines it is simply not an operable principle in international relations. We take into account China's core interests, but we have our own interests, and some of them are core interests, and there may be overlap, etc. So this is not something where you can make as a criterion for your relationship that we respect your definition of your core interests as opposed to ours. The world doesn't work that way. Diplomacy doesn't work that way. Insofar as China asks for mutual respect, then I think that is important, because it's difficult to improve relations with countries that won't treat you with reasonable respect. But that doesn't mean that we're accepting definitions of interests as defined by that country. I prefer the term fundamental interest. We have our fundamental interests, such as maintaining the security of our allies in East Asia. China has a fundamental interest in improving its security and ability to defend its home territory. Are those two compatible? That's at the heart of the issue of strategic rivalry between us. China wants to build up its military to the point where it might threaten our ability to be a support to our allies. If so, China is attacking one of our fundamental interests. On the other hand, if we try to hold down China's military development so that China can no longer defend its territory effectively, we're attacking one of China's fundamental interests. So we have to find some middle ground between that if we're going to be able to stabilize the strategic rivalry. So I prefer to talk about the issues in those types of terms and not get hung up on the issue of you've got to recognize my core interests or else, you know, we can't do this, that, or the other thing.
Got a quick comment from Bob up front and then back to Alan, and then
The quick comment is that in 2005, Robert Zoellick called upon China to become a responsible stakeholder. And who could imagine that China would ever say, yes, we want to become a responsible stakeholder? It's just inconceivable that China would have signed on to a particular rhetorical formulation coined by an American statesman. So if the Chinese, you go to a meeting and you think the meeting is about U.S.-China relations, and you get there and the banners behind the podium, behind the panel table, are all about Xin Qing Da Guo Guanxi, and you seem to be put into the position of saying, yes, we are signing under Xin Qing Da Guo Guanxi. It's unnecessary, and it shouldn't be pressed too hard any more than we should press responsible stakeholder on our Chinese friend.
thank you. Alan. Back here.
Alan Romberg, Stimson Center. I actually have a comment on this subject. I agree with what Stape Roy said, but I would take it to a somewhat different place and maybe, Robert, create another seminar for you. I think that, in fact, China, the problem came not with the three big headlines that you cited, no confrontation, mutual respect, and win-win. I think except for the discomfort, which Wang Wan mentioned with following Chinese slogans, that's really unexceptionable. But I think what is exceptionable is that China indeed wanted, and I think really in a way still does want, the United States to buy on the definition of mutual respect as being mutual respect for core interests and major concerns. And as you say, that is not going to happen, but the continued view that that is what should happen versus the Americans saying, no, that's not the way we're going to go, I think creates a tension and contributes to the mistrust that has been discussed in the last few minutes.
Thank you. We have one final question. Yes, sir.
Thank you. My name is Eddie Lechik. I'm a retired journalist. I wonder whether one could add to Ambassador Roy's chronology of significant events the fact that this year the International Monetary Fund announced that China's GDP has exceeded that of the United States, making China the world's largest economy, at least in terms of purchasing power parity. I wonder whether this event has been so anticipated that it barely causes a ripple, or whether you expect fireworks in Beijing, for instance, and whether this would reinforce the kind of the triumphalist view in China that, you know, we can deal with the United States, we don't have to worry about them. And from the other side, from the U.S. side, the kind of paranoia about China, you know, which exists in certain circles. I wonder whether this would any effect on the power balance or perceptions of the power balance.
Maybe we have 1 minute, so maybe if I could ask each of you, is America capable of responding constructively when the Chinese economy, as would seem to be inevitable, surpasses that of the United States, if not in purchasing power parity terms, then in a few years in absolute terms? In 2 sentences.
I think as an average citizen, we're most concerned with the quality of living. The average citizens, how much wealth and income can an average citizen have, and that's more important than a nominal world #1 GDP. And yeah.
I would have included it in my list because it was in the material I was looking at, but I didn't know whether to treat it as a positive or negative factor, and so I just left it out of the list. The IMF's thing was reported in the American media. Basically, it created a kind of ho-hum reaction. I think it has been discounted in large way in a sense that people have been anticipating, because we've been predicting for years that China's economy at some point was going to surpass the size of our GDP. But at the moment, there has not been a psychological reaction on the part of the American people or the American government that somehow this diminishes us in some fashion and we have to do something or other. So while I think it's a noteworthy point in China's continuing rise, it's not something that has altered the nature of the way that we deal with each other.
Sun Yun, last word.
All right, last word. I think the number of that statement deserves some deconstruction, because the first point I want to make is, although China's economy has been growing rapidly, but we also know that the current Xi Jinping administration also faces daunting tasks to manage or restructure the Chinese economy, and the task is not a simple one. And the second point I wish to make is economic wealth does not equal to comprehensive national power. So for China to translate that economic wealth or that economic power into political, security, informational, technological, innovation, capability in those aspects are still going to take a long time.
Well, Wang Guan, Ambassador Roy, Sun Yun, thank you very much for your insights. Thanks to all of you. Wang Guan mentioned differences in the educational systems and the way that that creates different perceptions and different expectations. I just wanted to note that next Friday, we are dedicating an entire morning session to this. We have the author of Who's Afraid of the Big Bad Dragon, Professor Zhao Yung, and Karen Fisher of the Chronicle of Higher Education to talk about the way that United States and Chinese educators look at, learn from each other for better or for worse. A different sort of program for us. We hope that you'll join us. Thank you very much.
I'm glad you made that. I thought about making it. It sounded too defensive. So I
can defend it.
I decided to take a different approach. But,
Sorry,